Let's talk about Benjamin Netanyahu. For decades, it's felt like you can't really tell the story of Israel without telling his story, especially when crisis hits. So today, we're going to try to unpack why that relationship is so incredibly complex and what it tells us about power, about survival, and about the very soul of a nation.
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. What actually happens when a leader in a national crisis becomes so tangled up that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins?
Well, you get to a point where a leader's own survival and the nation's survival start to feel like the exact same thing. And once that line gets blurry, oh man, everything gets complicated. Loyalty, criticism, even the rule of law. It's a very tricky place to be.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, we have to look at the two big competing ideas about Netanyahu. You could almost call them the two sides of the coin. Is he a guardian, a leader forged in the fires of constant danger? Or is he a survivor, a political master who's just learned how to use that danger to stay in power?
So let's take that guardian argument first. Thinkers like Douglas Murray basically say, look, you can't judge this guy without understanding the world he operates in, a world of constant threat. From this perspective, his toughness, his suspicion, those aren't character flaws. They're the armor a leader has to wear in a place like that.
But then there's the flip side. Thinkers like Yuval Noah Harari offer the survivor perspective. And the idea here is that if you're in charge long enough, you can start to believe that your story is the nation's story. And if you believe that, then any challenge to you personally feels like a threat to the nation itself.
So there you have it, the two poles of the argument. On one hand, you've got the protector, a man shaped by a genuinely dangerous reality. And on the other, a political operator who's maybe gotten a little too good at using that danger to his advantage. This is the central conflict we're digging into.
And look, this isn't just some abstract political science debate. Not at all. This tension plays out in very real ways. And a perfect example is the whole issue of the price of power. Specifically, the corruption charges that have been swirling around him for years.
So this is the million-dollar question, right? How do you know if it's a political witch hunt or actual, real-deal corruption? Well, you have figures like Alan Dershowitz who warn about something called selective prosecution. Basically, bending the rules to go after a leader the establishment just doesn't like. But then, legal experts like Preet Bharara say, hey, forget the politics, just follow the evidence. Is there a pattern of using public office for personal gain? That's the only question that matters.
But some thinkers, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, ask an even deeper question. What if the real corruption isn't about money at all? What if it starts much, much earlier, inside a leader's own mind? That moment when they convince themselves that them staying in power is a moral imperative, and that any action to make that happen is therefore justified.
And all of this whole tangled web of identity and power, was put to the ultimate, most brutal test with the catastrophic failures of October 7th and the crushing weight of leading a nation at war that came right after.
After a disaster, we all crave a simple truth, one person or one thing to blame. But columnist Bret argues that in reality, we have to hold two truths in our minds at the same time. First, the enemy is absolutely 100% guilty for the attack. But second, the nation's leadership is still accountable for the failures that allowed it to happen. The key is that these two ideas don't cancel each other out. They can both be true.
And this is where things get just agonizing for a democracy. This quote really says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures this impossible paradox. How can the leader you hold culpable for a disaster also be the one you feel is indispensable to get you through the crisis that follows? It's a terrible trap, where accountability feels almost impossible right when you need it the most.
So when you step back from all these dilemmas about leadership, about the law, about war, you're forced to ask a much bigger, more philosophical question. What does all of this reveal about the very soul of a nation?
Harari has this really powerful warning here. It's about what happens when an emergency stops being a temporary state and becomes, permanent. When fear isn't just an event, but the very atmosphere a society breathes. When that happens, values can get twisted. People stop asking if a decision is wise and only ask if it feels safe. And that's how a democracy can start to shrink from the inside.
And Ayaan Hirsi Ali pushes that idea even further. She argues that the greatest danger isn't losing an election, it's losing your moral memory. It's that point where a nation gets so used to the compromises it makes for survival that it completely forgets they were compromises to begin with.
So ultimately, what the source material seems to be telling us is that for any nation that finds itself in a state of permanent crisis, the real choice isn't about some simple verdict on a single leader. No, it's a daily choice between facing hard, uncomfortable truths about yourself or choosing the comfort of a story that makes you feel good.
And so that leaves us with this final hanging question. It's really the one that sits on top of everything we've talked about. When the need to survive stops being a reason and becomes a justification for everything, for every compromise, for every moral shortcut, what does that do to the soul of a people? And that's a question that's so much bigger than one man or one country. It's one for all of us to really think about.